Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. You are still watching NTV Weekend Edition. Now, the Uganda Revenue Authority has been in the news in recent weeks over its increased enforcement measures, prompting concern among taxpayers. While some have deployed tax lawyers to navigate the challenges involved in tax assignment to avoid paying hefty taxes, others are also concerned about whether the tax tribunal can deliver a fair appeal. Now, to help us understand some of the challenges involved, we have an advocate, Dennis Kakembo. Good evening and welcome to Talk of the Nation.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here today.
All right, thank you. So we note that there are so many reports of taxpayers complaining about the enhanced measures by the URA. What exactly is going on? Last year,
Uganda Revenue Authority had a target of 25 trillion to collect in taxes, and they hit the target. This year, the financial year ending 2024, the target was enhanced to 29 trillion, and URA has been slightly off course. And if you remember, I think late last year, the minister, the PS in the Ministry of Finance wrote a letter, strongly worded letter to URA, trying to explain, why they are not, collections are not on course. So as a result of that, we are seeing increased vigilance of URA, going after taxpayers, issuing assessments to ensure that taxpayers do comply. But of course, in the course of that, taxpayers are also raising quite a number of concerns. And I think for us to fully appreciate this, we need to listen to both. And for the longest time, the aspiration of the government has been to increase tax collections from the current about 13% ratio of GDP to about 18% as a ratio of the GDP. But for the last, I think, over 15 years, we've struggled to hit that. So government has been working very hard to ensure that there's that improvement. Okay. Now, many of the measures we see today in terms of the laws which are passed, or even administration measures that URA comes up with, are aimed at enhancing that. But in doing that, the business community is saying that maybe Uganda's tax policy is quite short-term. All it's looking at is collecting revenues in the short term, regardless of the effect and the impact it's going to have on the economy. Yes,
because they actually wanted us to interrogate that increase from the 25 trillion of the last financial year to the 29 trillion of this financial year, what that impacts the taxpayer.
Yes, okay. Now, first and foremost, I don't know the science that the government uses to determine what it must collect as tax revenues, because there's what we call tax yield. So even if you say we need to collect 29 trillion, but the economy cannot sustain that, then it's a futile exercise. So first and foremost, I think the government needs to be convinced by itself, but that by the nature of economic activity, by the nature of how the economy stands, that 29 trillion can be collected. Because if that 29 trillion cannot be collected, even if you ask URA to collect it, they'll struggle. Or else, they'll end up being very aggressive on the taxpayers, and that aggression can end up in some businesses closing.
Okay. Yes. Now, some say that they're very uncomfortable with the enforcement measures being deployed by the tax collector, and so they are left with no option but to hire a tax lawyer to help them sort this problem out. Yes. Highlight for us the advantages of having a tax lawyer in this case in point.
Now, usually when URA has a concern with you, they can do an audit. So they'll ask for information from you, and then I'll look in that information, and the process can be short or long. It can take weeks or a few months, and for some very complex audits, the process can be long. So you share information with them. Now, once the audit is done, URA may issue what they call an assessment, and that assessment will show the tax you've underpaid and what you're supposed to pay. Now, usually that process, it's accountants who are involved, because it's the numbers that are interrogated.
Yes.
Now, once URA issues an assessment, a taxpayer has an opportunity to go within the URA and object. So you have 45 days when an assessment is issued. So you go back to the URA and then you tell them, I don't agree with the findings you came up with for this reason. Now URA would then have to respond to you to either accept your objection or confirm the objection. Now when they confirm that objection, the option you have as a taxpayer is going to the Tax Appeals Tribunal to ask for a review of the URA decision. Now the challenge that you have, which actually comes about because of the pressure URA is under, first and foremost, there are instances when URA is quite overzealous. That is what the taxpayers say. That because they have a target to meet, even if you present them with evidence that confirms that their assessment was wrong, they will never take that into account because they are pushing you into the Tax Appeals Tribunal where...
But they have the records.
Yes.
They have the records.
Yes.
And so why would someone say they're being pushed?
Even me as a tax practitioner, I know, especially at this point in time, because you have 4 months to the financial year. With URA underperforming, there's sometimes pressure to collect whatever it takes. We have to hit the target. So in a situation like that, quite often, even if someone has legitimate concerns, taxpayers complain that sometimes their views are not taken into account, not to escalate the dispute further. So when the matter goes to the Tax Appeals Tribunal, before the Tax Appeals Tribunal hears you out, you have to pay tax in dispute, 30% of the tax in dispute. That is to say, if URA has demanded for 10 billion, before you give an audience in the Tax Appeals Tribunal, you must pay 30% of that, which means you have to pay 3 billion of that.
So are you saying the tribunal is not helping Ugandans? The
tribunal helps Ugandans, and a lot. I mean, there are so many cases where taxpayers, when they dispute the URA position, they actually get justice, and the tribunal rules in their favor. But there's a constraint, and that constraint is you have to pay 30% before a matter is heard. So if you do not have the capacity or ability to pay that 30%, certainly you will not get the audience that you require. But then also the other issue which taxpayers raise is that, supposing URA has issued an incorrect assessment of maybe 50 billion, when actually the assessment ought to have been 1 billion. That would mean that I have to look for 30% of the 50 billion, which ordinarily I ought not to have looked for. And that is why some people are saying that the objection process, URA being, you cannot be the assessor and the judge in your own case. That is why some people are starting to think that probably it's time that we had someone called the Ombudsman. The Ombudsman looks into the decisions of URA. The Ombudsman looks into the actions of the tax authority, so that by the time a taxpayer goes to the Tax Appeals Tribunal, you have the peace of mind that a slightly independent person, other than the person who issued the assessment, is the one who has looked into this.
Okay.
Yes.
And so now, Mildred is a trader.
Yes.
And probably I have gotten a discrepancy with URA in regards to the tax, as you have clearly highlighted, and I want to go to appeal to the tax tribunal.
Yes.
And you have mentioned all of this. Then how do they proceed with the 30% that I have to pay first before? How then do I proceed? Where do I go if I needed, you know, the help and yet I'm not getting it from the tax tribunal?
Now, when URA confirms that they have disputed your objection and they've not accepted it, you have 30 days as a taxpayer to lodge your appeal or review application in the Tax Appeals Tribunal. The Tax Appeals Tribunal is on Nick building. I think it must be on the 10th floor. Now, the Tax Appeals Tribunal is, in as much as it is judicial, quasi-judicial, it's a bit informal. So even a non-lawyer can represent. It's preferable that lawyers are the ones who represent you, because a lot of the processes, they mirror the law. But even if you're not a lawyer, I see lots of accountants there, or even some taxpayers self-represent themselves.
Okay.
So you just have to be quite cautious of the dates. because if you miss out in the 30 days, that means your right to appeal against the URA decision might be lost, and then you have to apply for permission to appeal out of time, which can all be time consuming. But I would recommend that usually go for tax lawyers, because tax lawyers comprehend and understand how matters can be done. Now, when you go in the tax appeals tribunals, you start with, you file all your documents that are required, and then you start with mediation. During that mediation stage, you're given another opportunity to sit down with URA to see whether there's still a chance for amicable resolution of the matter.
You advised us to go to the tax lawyers, but these are also costly. It comes with a cost.
Yes.
On top of the other money that you're supposed to pay to the tribunal.
Yes. What I know is that sometimes it's actually, inaction is more costly. I will say, I mean, I believe tax lawyers are expensive, but you might find that because you've not hired that best tax lawyer, you actually end up paying a lot more, because if you lose your case, the cost will be much more than you paying the fees for you getting the best representation.
Can the tribunal ever rule against the Uganda Revenue Authority in a case that a taxpayer has, you know, won the case?
Yes, there are so many cases
that have seen the light of day.
Yes, so many cases where the tribunal has ruled against the URA, and there are also cases where the tribunal upholds the position of the URA. Now, if you're not happy with the decision of the tribunal when it's made a decision, either URA or the taxpayer, you still have an opportunity of appealing further in the High Court. Even when the High Court makes a decision and you're not happy with the decision of the High Court, you can still appeal to the Court of Appeal. Even when the Court of Appeal makes a decision you're not happy with, you can appeal to the Supreme Court, which is the final court. But of course the challenge with that is that tax matters are quite technical, and these are matters that deal with commercial issues. So closure is key. Quick resolution of matters is key for businesses to move forward.
Have there been those cases that have reached that level of the Supreme Court?
Yes. There are some cases. I think there's a case that involved Airtel about 4 months ago. It reached, and there are some cases, there's a car valuation. That is a case which was lodged, I think, 2010. So for 14 years, that dispute has not yet been resolved, because I think URA appealed to the Supreme Court. So while it's helpful to have quite a number of avenues for taxpayers to escalate their tax matters, but we also need to be mindful that protracted litigations do not seem or augur well for the country's commercial structure, because tax matters are expeditious. Just imagine you raised an assessment of 30 billion as a taxpayer. Before that matter goes, it's heard in the tribunal, I've paid 30%, that is 10 billion, which is already locked in. So that 10 billion, I wait for another 14 years for maybe the Supreme Court to rule in my favor, and then get back that money from URA. By the time I get back that money, if I pay 10 billion 10 years ago, what would be the time value of money then? So that is why some of us are actually starting to think that we need to shorten the dispute resolution process for tax matters. Have URA issue an assessment. Create the office of the ombudsman, who should be the one to handle the objections. Then from the ombudsman, have a tax appeals tribunal. Make sure that you give it very independent, constituted very well, put there the best members that can be very technical, and then let the appeal process probably end at High Court, so that you shorten the time span within which tax disputes are resolved.
As we come to a closure of this conversation, highlight some of the challenges that come with appealing a tax tribunal case.
I think the biggest challenge is that you have to pay the 30%. I have seen very good cases where honestly a taxpayer can win a case, but he just does not have the ability to pay the 30%. So if you do not have the ability to pay the 30%, it means that you cannot be heard.
Okay.
Then also, secondly, there's a tendency of taxpayers fearing to take on URA. Some are like, but if I take on URA, you never know, they might retaliate in a way that might affect my business. worse. I do not think that is how URA behaves, because ultimately, if we have a tax dispute, just like if URA also has a tax dispute with you, they can challenge your decision up and against. So what I would urge taxpayers there, if you feel your right has been violated, please do not fear taking on URA. That is how a country becomes better. That is how a tax system becomes better, and that's how we hold URA accountable.
So do you think in that regard of the aspect of paying the 30%, do you think the law should be reviewed and possibly amended and you know, bring independent tax experts in interest of a fair hearing?
There's actually been a case there. There's I think the Fuel X case. And then there's also another case. I've forgotten the title. The case, it was decided in the Supreme Court. And the issue at hand was whether the imposition of 30% was not affecting the right to get justice, to access.
Okay.
And I think the Supreme Court upheld it. But then the Court of Appeal actually was of the view that maybe the 30% was unconstitutional because it was restraining people from opening the doors of justice.
Okay, so as finally, how then do we strike a balance between the URA ensuring that they hit their target while not burdening the taxpayer?
What I can say is that all the stakeholders in Uganda's tax system are not happy with the tax regime. The government says the government has a concern that it's not been able to raise the 18% ratio to GDP. URA is struggling to hit targets. The taxpayers are saying, URA, you're overly aggressive. So if all the stakeholders in Uganda's tax system are not happy, it means we have to take a step back. It means that the system is not right. It means that we need to have a dialogue as us, all the stakeholders, and do a self-correction. Okay. Otherwise, if we keep carrying it on as it is, we are unlikely to get results that we need.
Well, thank you so much, Dennis, for making time to speak to us. Dennis Kakembo, a tax advocate, getting to share with us what is in for you, the taxpayer, in case you have discrepancies. And that conversation takes us in for a break. When we return, we'll hear from the world of sport.